Well, good morning.
Morning.
We are 9 a.m. At least on my computer, we're 9 a.m. Okay, I'm going to give you some books that I've read probably since June as well. But one of them, I opened up this book, and this is what it read. It's too long to put on a screen and kind of go through it all, but just listen to this. This is the opening chapter of this book called The Disappearing Church by Mark Sayers. He says, something has changed. Can you feel it? The air temperature has suddenly dropped and strong breeze has descended. The long-watched leaden clouds of secularism are now foreboding overhead. Heavy drops splatter around us, promising a downpour of disbelief. Anxiously, we look for shelter, for cover, for higher ground. We wonder if the structures and shelters that surround us will withstand the impending flood. After the deluge, what will stand? Which of our structures have strong enough foundations? Which trees have deep enough roots? Who has the resilience to hold on when the waters come? Before an impending storm, a gnawing sense of fragility is felt in your bones. What will remain? What will disappear? In the West, we are witnessing a number of disappearances. The ongoing disappearance of Judeo-Christian worldview from Western culture, the disappearance of a large segment of believers who across the Western world are leaving churches, walking away from active faith or faith altogether. During their young adult years, the disappearances of thousands of churches across the West, as churches close or begin the process of winding down, and as the heavily represented builder and boomer generations within the church enter their twilight years and pass from this life, the disappearance of a mode of church engagement characterized by commitment, resilience, and sacrifice among many Western believers. In its place, a new mode of disengaged Christian faith and church interaction is emerging. This new mode is characterized by sporadic engagement, passivity, commitment phobia, and a consumerist framework. We had hoped that the dark clouds of secularism, promising their downpour of meaninglessness, would eventually drive Westerners into the shelter of the church. Yet we discover what we view as dark clouds are viewed by many as the breaking through of a glorious sun and the arrival of warm, blue, post-Christian skies. Think I wanted to read this book? This was just the beginning of it. Mark Sayers went on to write two other books, one called The Reappearing Church, and the other one called A Non-Anxious Presence. And all three of them are definitely worth reading. They definitely give us some understanding of what we're in and what we're living in. He has perhaps one of the best views of what's going on in the Western world as it pertains to church. It's pretty enlightening. So we're dealing with walking right side up in an upside down world. And what does that mean? Well, let me give you a couple of scripture verses that, going the wrong way. This is Jacob's view or prophecy over his sons before he dies. And tell you how I got here in a minute. It says, Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between the sheepfolds. Put parentheses around those, underline them, and put them in bold letters. Okay, because that's really the prophecy that he's given to us. He says, when he saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to carry burdens and became a slave at forced labor. Now, when you think of the tribe of Issachar, what What do you think of what was said about the sons of Issachar? Anybody know?
They knew the times they were living.
They knew the times that they were living, and they had knowledge of what to do. Here's the verse. These are the sons of Issachar when they came to David after David made his throne in Hebron, and all Israel gathered to him. And the writer just says the sons of Issachar understood their times and had knowledge, with knowledge of what Israel should do. They were, I believe, was it Second Samuel says that there were 87,000 men that came to fight with David or for David. So what we're going to look at today is I'm going to give you a broad history of thought. Doesn't that sound exciting, tingling? Everybody's excited. They're thinking that's important. Let me just say this, that when I went to seminary, the one thing that I had no desire to do was to study philosophy. I had absolutely zero. Philosophy had been painted as this dark, useless exercise of reading and arguing and all these other things. And one of the things I had to do, because the seminary I went to, while I really agreed with the apologetics and the theology, most of the theology that Dr. Geisler had, I disagreed with some non-essential things that he agreed on, like drinking wine. That was, of course, I disagreed with that. And actually, after I talked with him about it, he understood where I was coming from. But I have to say that what I came out of seminary with when I did my master's was, I can't even say a great appreciation for philosophy. That would be understating it. I have to say that I think I've become an amateur philosopher. I don't have a PhD in philosophy, so I can't say I'm a philosopher. But I know enough of it now to make me understand how important it is, not just how interesting it is, because it's extremely interesting once you get into it, but it is so necessary to understand what's going on. And those of you who know me know I'm a big picture person, and so when I look at things, I kind of try to get the whole grasp of it to understand the particular parts in it. So we're going to look at that, and perhaps that's going to be the backbone of everything else we understand. Okay. So those are two things. Actually, there's four things. Then, who are we? Did I cover the other one? I didn't mention the second one there, did I, when I went to the first? Where are we? Where are we in this whole history of thought? That's the important part. Who are we, and where are we in the great story? You know the great story, I called it the big story before. The great story is God made it, we broke it, Jesus fixed it, right? Everybody remembers that, right? And where are we in that story? In other words, what's our responsibility in that story? So we'll look at some of that. So I'll do a little bit of preaching today as well. Okay, so the broad history of thought basically breaks down into four periods. The four periods are ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, modern philosophy, and contemporary philosophy. So those are the four periods that those who are philosophers and theologians, because every one of those periods has a major theme on theology and on philosophy. And we'll see how those things work, so you could see how far they go. I have a graph, or at least a schematic, of how they change for us. So the chart, across the top, there we are. Across the top we have ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary. You can't, didn't have room to spell it all out. But basically, ancient philosophy starts around 600 BC. And I could give you the names of all the people that, not all the people, but the major players in each one of those, but I don't want to bore you too much with those things. But they start in 600 BC, they go to 400 AD. So that's quite a long gap where that's the ancient part of philosophy, which I think is one of the most interesting things just because of how those records have survived, how they've come down to us. Then we go into what we call the medieval period. Now, the medieval period, by later philosophers and thinkers, called the medieval period the Dark Ages. Okay, but they called themselves the Enlightenment. Very interesting. And then you go into that goes from 400 to 1400. And probably the two names that you would recognize, I'll probably mention them again later. 400 AD to 1400 AD. 400 AD, anybody know who the leading theologian would be in that period? Augustine. He'd be the person that would start the shift because he was perhaps the most prolific writer. The end of it goes to 1400 AD, and that ends with Thomas Aquinas and that group of, we think of them as Catholics. They certainly were part of the Catholic Church, and Western philosophy excludes the Orthodox Church. We don't, for some reason, and I think it's because of the split between Rome and Constantinople, the Eastern Western Church, that we don't recognize all the other writers that are there. But there are some terrific writers in that period as well. Okay, so 1400 to 1900 is the modern period. And I'll just say this, we're going to look at them, we'll look at the things that are there. My mind just wants to run with it. They try to undo everything in the medieval period. They actually try to undo it, and we'll see why in a minute. And then finally you have the contemporary, which goes from 1900 up until around now. Anybody know who 1900 represents, or what 1900 represents? Number one philosopher, input, person who has affected everything for the last 120, 130 years. Hume was earlier. Hume was earlier. He was end of the 1800s. Freud is in there. Kierkegaard is in there. He's part of the modern period. Friedrich Nietzsche. God is dead. Yeah, everybody goes, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He's the one who affected us or affects us even today, and we'll see how these things work. Okay, so ancient philosophy, the major theology was polytheism, more than one God. Now, in each one of these things, saying that polytheism was the major theology doesn't mean that there weren't atheists, and it doesn't mean that there wasn't theists. It just means that was the major theology. So basically they had many gods. And their philosophy, the correct word is cosmogony, but we say cosmology, not to be confused with cosmetology. But basically they were looking at what was the beginning. What was the beginning of nature. And the ancients basically were really looking at fire, air, water. They were looking at these things and matter and looking at what was the beginning. That's mainly what you look at them. It was only Plato and Aristotle that actually stepped outside the box and started to say that there was something invisible. But neither one of them nailed down an accurate view of God, though they did view things like logic. Aristotle wrote the first or the earliest book that we have that we know of on logic, and it is called Aristotelian Logic, which again has been pushed to the side or disregarded altogether. And I'll give you a clue right now, because in Aristotelian logic you can come to conclusions. So you can say, this exists because of this. And so today, if you go looking for Aristotelian logic, there's only 2 books that are in print today or written today that talk about Aristotelian logic. There are over 500 books on what's called symbolic logic, which is a mystery even to the people who yeah, even it's a very difficult book. There's a great book out by a man called Veach. I'm trying to think of his first name, but the name of the book is Two Logics, where he destroys symbolic logic with Aristotelian logic. Guess how important that book is. Yeah. So during the medieval period, the major theology was theism. You're starting with Augustine. You're ending with people like Aquinas. So all during that 1,000-year period, people are looking at, or the theology that's there is that there is one God. And you have Judaism and Islam in that mix because they're all monotheists. They all believe in one God, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. They all believe in one God. Now, whether that is the same God that they're all talking about, but they believe in this idea that one God, theism is that one God acts outside of himself to create the universe and then interacts in the world. Basically, that would be a very broad definition of what theism is. So you have Judaism, Islam, and Christianity being the major players in that. Of course, talking about the Western world too. And the philosophy is metaphysics. Metaphysics just asks a question, what's the nature of that thing? It's the study of things that exist. So in metaphysics, you're always asking the question, what's its nature? What's its essence? Because you can determine what it is once you can determine what its essence is. So humans have a certain essence that make them human. And dogs, cats, whatever, they make them what they are. An apple has an essence from an apple tree. So that was the study of metaphysics, and that's what it was. Yeah. Tony, could you answer that last question that came up there? I can get him the reference for that. I just can't go for it right now. So we're good on that? Yeah? So here's the period of philosophy and theology that I study the most. Thomas Aquinas, who was lived in the 14th century, was born in 1326, died in 1376, I think it was, or 1370, somewhere around there. He was 49 years old, didn't have his 50th birthday. Wrote the equivalent of 300 books that we would equate that's how many he wrote in his 49 short years. He affected certainly Roman Catholicism more than any other writer. They all go back to Thomas, and his Summa Theologica is 5 volumes of his writing that weren't finished. He was still writing the last one when he died. I've read a few different biographies, not autobiographies, of Aquinas. But when he was young, he was a very large boy, so they called him the dumb ox because he was quiet. And There was another, one of his mentors is called Alfred the Great, said that you may call him the dumb ox, but one day you're going to hear him roar. And
where was he from? What?
he was from Italy. He was Italian. His parents wanted him to become a Benedictine monk because they were the most powerful, but he went to the Dominicans because they were preaching the gospel, and he wanted to preach. But back then, of course, you don't have TV, you don't have radio, you don't have internet, you don't have computers. All you have is books. You have things that are written. So it's said of Thomas that he memorized the entire Bible, that he could quote it by memory. His brothers tried to, they kidnapped him when he said he wanted to become a Dominican, and they sent hookers, prostitutes, into the room where he was held to try to seduce him, and he took firebrands out of the fireplace and chased them out of the room. It's one of those stories about Aquinas. But not easy to understand in a lot of ways, because just the way that they wrote in those days, the way that they put things forth. Sorry, I'm going off on a track here, but the way Thomas's writings are, his Summa Contra Gentiles, he wrote several commentaries on Aristotle, and that's why some people don't appreciate him so much, because he went to Greek philosophers and they say he baptized Aristotle. He took what was true by nature from Aristotle and used it in what's called natural theology. So you'll hear a lot of people, mainly from the Reformed camp, who will disparage Aquinas. But when you read them, when you're reading the people from the Reformation, and you know Aquinas' writings, you realize they're taking his stuff without giving him credit that this is where they're getting it. And it's kind of like they're making it sound like they got it from sucking on their own fingers. Like they came up with these things. And that isn't true at all. But the way that they would write is that if they would start off by saying something like, "It is said that God is not a Trinity." And then they would give you the arguments for that statement, that premise, that God is not a Trinity. And when you're reading it, you're thinking like, this is really good. They got some really good arguments. And then he stops and he says, "But I say," and then he refutes every one of their pieces. So you have to think that's the way they wrote to really get around it. And you could understand, I went to seminary not even wanting this stuff and came out thinking, this is really good stuff here. His theology is perhaps the best I've ever read. I mean, he makes a case for God and the Trinity and Jesus that is just over the top. Best of anything. Everybody who says anything good, I think, is getting it from Aquinas. Okay.